Welcome to Equipped for Impact, the podcast designed to assist Christian parents, leaders, and educators to raise up the next generation to stand firm in their faith and influence the world for Christ. We're your hosts. I'm Nate.
And I'm Lewis.
So let's get started. Lewis, this is part two. It's a two-parter. We got into it last week and realized as we start talking about responding to cultural challenges biblically, there's a lot to unpack there. So you want to just kind of refresh our memory of what was it that we talked about last week?
So if you didn't listen to last week's episode, make sure to go back and listen to it, right? Because you're going to get lost here. I'm going to do my best to catch you up. But we talked about a biblical framework for engaging culture. And we talked about three options. So we have the option to retreat. We call that isolation, and you can just avoid culture entirely. We talked about conforming, and that's compromising, right? That's when you begin to blend in with the culture, and it makes it hard to distinguish between a Christian biblical worldview and the culture. And then we talked about the third option, which is engaging the culture. And I like to call that biblical boldness, right?
Yep.
In Matthew 5:14, Jesus tells us that we are the light of the world. We are a city that is set on a hill that cannot be hidden. And so I think that's the right response, right?
Yep.
We engage culture with biblical boldness.
And I realized we missed a prime opportunity. That as we talked about, you are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. You could tell your kids to be salty and lit.
Yes, we could.
And then they would probably laugh at you
They could.
and say, "Stop making dad jokes.
But
You're
they
not
would
cool."
appreciate it. They would appreciate. I think that's the first dad joke you've brought into the discussion.
Man, we're starting something.
More to come. If you don't listen for any other reason, maybe you'll just listen for the dad jokes. But so when we talk about engaging culture with biblical boldness, what we're talking about is we don't retreat, we don't conform, but we stand firm in truth while showing grace and love. And then we pointed to the example of Jesus.
Yep. Yeah. He always a good place to start if you're talking about examples of how to live the Christian life is with Jesus. And so we talked about the woman at the well in John chapter 4 and how, she was there and Jesus didn't shy away from the tough conversations. He leaned in, he had that conversation. But I think the biggest point was it was a conversation, right?
Yeah.
He asked questions, he probed. When she tried to redirect the conversation to other things, he brought her back. And as parents, that's how we need to disciple our kids, right? We're engaging with the culture so that they can stand firm and they can reflect, Christ's love. Even in all that interaction, he was trying to bring that woman at the well to a restored relationship with him.
Yeah.
And then sent her back out into the village as a witness.
And that's where we left off last week.
Yep.
And I mentioned that this week, in this episode, we're going to talk about Paul, and we're also going to look at the early church. So when we talk about Paul, he gives us another great example of how we, as Christians, can engage a culture that doesn't know God. And look, if you look at the world around us today, we live in a post-Christian society.
Yep.
Like it is not a society that is friendly to Christians. In fact, just last week, I was reading about how Disney has just produced a show and they have the first openly Christian character in like 13 years. And the media was making a big deal about it. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's a big deal. Disney has a Christian character. But it just goes to show you like how far we've moved away from...
That's newsworthy.
Yeah, I mean, our family, we like to watch The Little House on the Prairie, and I mean, they have episodes that are dedicated to church services. And I mean, obviously, it wasn't a Christian show, but I mean, that was common back then.
Yeah.
Today, it's a big deal when a major production like Disney has a Christian character.
Right.
And so, what we see here with Paul is in Acts 17, he goes to Athens and he sees that the city is full of idols. And if you don't know where Athens is, it's ancient Greece, right? So think about the Greek pantheon of gods. And so Paul's there in Athens. He sees all of these false idols, and he could have started by condemning their false worship. He could have cast stones, and he could have made them feel less than him. But instead, he used their own culture as a bridge to the gospel.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is that, he's right in the middle of the Areopagus, right? It's their place, kind of their university, right? They stand there, they have these cultural debates, there's idol, like statues all around, and he uses that, like you said, as a bridge in the conversation. He points around and he says, I see you're all very religious. And then they had a statue to the unknown God. And so he used that as an example to bring them to at least introducing the topic of who, the true creator God is. And I love that example because he didn't attack them. He didn't attack their worldview. He started with something they understood and moved them to the truth. Like a great example for us, like it would be really easy for us to like point at some of the gender issues, the LGBTQ plus stuff, and we could just rail against it, which it's wrong, but we could also use that as a bridge. It's the people, right? It's coming from an innate desire for love and for belonging and for meaning, and so you can affirm that good desire, but point out in a gentle way how that is an incorrect fulfillment of that desire. Make that connection in the conversation.
And that's such a powerful lesson, right? Because when Paul was in the center of this area, he's with like really smart people. He's with the philosophers of the time.
The PhDs of the day.
Yes. Yep. And philosophy is no joke. Like I'm taking a philosophy class right now in my Master's of Divinity program. And most of the time, I don't understand what I'm reading. And I'm like, man, these guys were wild just with their thoughts, right? But Paul didn't compromise his beliefs. Like Paul wasn't a philosopher. Now, Paul was smart and he was a theologian in his own right. I mean, he wasn't some chump, but he didn't water down the gospel to make it more acceptable to these to these philosophers. But he also didn't just shout at people and tell them they were wrong. And I think sometimes that's where we lose.
It's the guy on the street with the sign, you know.
Like I think that's where we lose our footing sometimes, because if we're not careful, like we can come across as condemning and as judgmental. But what Paul does here is he engages with wisdom. He meets the people right where they are, and he points them to Christ.
Yeah. And as parents, that's exactly how we need to train our kids, right? The world is full of false ideas. And instead of just telling them to avoid it all or to point and say, that's terrible, we need to teach them how to engage with it biblically. If we want them to influence their world for Christ, right? That's how we end every podcast episode here. They need to understand how to interact with people who don't, hopefully yet, believe while still standing in truth, right? And not compromising in their conversations.
Because if we're honest with ourselves, on a daily basis, we are encountering people who don't believe like us, right? And you watch TV, you watch the news, you watch popular TV shows, you listen to music. The majority of the people that we're encountering daily aren't Christians. And so this gives us a perfect example. Now, looking past Paul, we see the early church. And the early church was bold, but it was full of grace, right? In the book of Acts 4:19, it says, we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. So they were conscious of the fact that they needed to be bold, they needed to be gracious, and they understand that they have to speak what they've seen. So in Acts 4, Peter and John had just healed a man, and this man had was a beggar, and they come to him and they heal him, and then the religious leaders tell them to stop preaching about Jesus, right? You can't do this. But how do they respond? Yeah,
with boldness, right? They didn't. That's what you just read there. Those two verses, right? We cannot speak but what we have seen and heard. They didn't back down, even when they were threatened, right? They were beaten, they were stoned, they were put in prison, all these different things, you know. But I think what's really interesting here is that they did all of that, and they didn't do it with an arrogant attitude. They didn't do it disrespectfully. You know, they weren't pointing fingers or being rude, right? Because nothing's going to shut somebody down than, quicker than just name calling, telling somebody that they're, ridiculous, or that's terrible, they're a bad person, things like that. They said the truth, what they fully believed, because they'd seen it, they'd heard it, but they still did that with grace and with humility in how they delivered their message.
And I think that's important. It reminds me of a quote from Charles Spurgeon, right? The Prince of Preachers. He says, "The word of God is like a lion. You don't have to defend a lion. You just turn it loose and it will defend itself."
Yep.
And so we don't have to be arrogant. We don't have to have this holier than thou attitude. We just need to rely on the word of God and turn it loose. And this is what we want to instill in our kids. We want to raise a generation that's not afraid to stand up for Christ, but we also want them to do it in a way that reflects the love and grace of Jesus. And we see this in the early church, right? They didn't cower in fear, but they also didn't fight culture with hostility. I mean, we see how that played out through the Crusades, right?
Yeah.
Like when Christianity took on arms and had armies that were going and trying to like conquer the world, like that didn't go good.
No,
because
that's
that's not what God wants from us. And so they lived out the gospel. They spoke boldly. And they trusted God with the results, right? Like Charles Spurgeon says, right? You just have to turn it loose and it will defend itself.
So I think we've got a good idea of what the model is, right? We want to follow this model. Jesus, Paul, the early church, right? They're great examples, biblical examples. And I'm convinced, right? We need to train up our children to respond and engage this way, especially with people who don't yet believe. Shine the light of Christ, be the salt of the earth, all of these things. But really, what does this look like practically? Like, could you give us some practical steps we could walk through if we're trying to do this with our children?
Yeah. And so for those of you that are listening, you might be asking, what can we as parents do to disciple our kids in today's culture? How do we equip them to stand firm when they're being bombarded with messages that contradict God's truths, right? And so we're going to cover 4 key steps. And the first one is teaching biblical discernment.
But biblical discernment is really what it comes down to, is just how to think biblically. If you guys remember, it was episode 4, we talked about, the importance of a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
It's those glasses that you're looking through. And so if you are training your kids, in a world where truth is constantly redefined, our children need those glasses that they're looking through, that's like filtering everything coming at them, so that they can really see that and think first with what does the Bible say about what we're facing today.
Francis Schaeffer says Christians must critique culture through the lens of Scripture. And what that means is that instead of just accepting whatever the world says, we need to train our kids to ask the right questions. Is this true? Does this align with God's word? Is this good? Does this promote righteousness or sin? Is this glorifying to God? Does this point me toward Christ, or does it point me away from Him? And I think just asking those 3 questions in any situation. I mean, whether you're talking about a TV show you watch, music you listen to, a quote that you read on the internet, the latest TikTok trend, right? Is this true? Is this good? And is this glorifying to God? Yeah.
And I think this is good. Like, this is a great opportunity for us to model for ourselves, right? Whatever we're consuming, whatever we're dealing with, right? Whether it's a movie, a song, social media post, like you said, a quote on the internet, right? Because we've said before, Abraham Lincoln said,
everything you read on the internet is true.
It's exactly right. Everything you read on the internet is true. But that's where we need the little sarcasm button again. We're going to get one of those. But I think that's good for us, right? We're watching a movie, we're listening to a song, and then it's like, is this good? Is this helpful, right? Is it promoting righteousness? Is it even true to start with? I've said it before, but Disney movies, like the songs in Disney movies are so loaded with worldview implications. It's the whole listen to your heart idea. Is that true? Like, what's really going to happen if my kid is acting like the character on this movie? Like, we need to see that, and we need to at least like mention it to help counteract the false worldviews that are coming into our lives.
And the second thing we need to do is we need to train our kids not just to know the truth, but they need to know how to share it with grace, right? So we looked at the example of Jesus, Paul, and the early church, And what we see today is that too many Christians either go silent because they're afraid of offending people, so they just don't say anything at all, or they come across as harsh and argumentative. But the Bible gives us a better way.
Yeah. Just making me think through this. My first thought went to 1 Peter chapter 3, and that's the classic passage where we like to quote it in 3:15. It says, "Always be prepared to give an answer," and that's where it's the Greek word apologia. It's where we get apologetics. You may have heard that in your church, or if you went to Bible college or something like that. But I love the context of that verse because the context is really you're standing out for your faith. And because you're living different than the culture around you, like we're talking about, then people are going to ask you. You might even be persecuted, and you're doing it, gently and humbly and glorifying to God. And then it says, when they ask you, you should be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And I think that's a big point that is sometimes lost in our churches is, we're doing this boldly, we're living differently, but we're full of grace, just like we saw Jesus with the woman at the well.
Tim Keller puts it really well when he says, truth without grace is harsh, but grace without truth is sentimentality, right? When we're talking about, hold on, let me finish the quote here. I'm sorry. Truth without grace is harsh. Grace without truth is sentimentality, but truth and grace together is the gospel. I wanted to jump ahead here, right? And so we need to train our kids to stand firm without being rude and to be loving without compromising the truth. We live in a culture today where it says, if you love me, you're not going to say anything about me, right? Like even if it's harmful to me, love means that you don't say anything.
Right.
But that's not true, right?
No, it's unloving to let your kid play in the street.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you got to say something. You got to say something about it, and you're doing it from a place of love, right? But you're not backing down when it comes to the truth. And so, if there's an issue that comes up in culture, right, we need to, as parents, be the first ones to kind of broach that topic with our students or with our children and do it from a biblical perspective. And, it's kind of hard because there's constantly changes in culture. We've talked about the current versus the waves, right? These are those waves that it's just coming one thing after another. And when you think you've got one figured out, here's a new one coming. It's a new issue. So what resources would you recommend, Lewis, for parents who are trying to stay on top of some of these issues and think through it from a biblical perspective?
Let me make a quick plug on a podcast that parents, if you're into podcasts that you can listen to, it's called The Briefing.
They are into podcasts because they're listening to one right now.
That's right. The Briefing by Al Mohler. And this is a daily podcast that's going to help you as Christians understand current events through a biblical lens. And so maybe, by us giving them a shout out, maybe if they listen to our podcast, they'll give us a shout out.
Maybe. There's two others that I have found really helpful. My time as a youth pastor, I used a lot of the stuff from Axis. It's axis.org, and they've got a weekly newsletter for parents. I don't think they've got a podcast. Maybe we could help them start one.
We should.
But they've got a weekly email that kind of is like, these are the big trends coming this week. And so it's axis.org. We'll link to that in the show notes. And another one is the Colson Center for a Biblical Worldview. They have their Breakpoint podcast that has both daily episodes as well as a weekly one where they're going through and they will deal with whatever is big in the news. So if you want more listening material other than Nate and Lewis talking about things, those would be good ones to check out.
So the next thing is we need to create an environment where faith conversations are normal. If we only talk about God on Sundays, our kids will think that faith is just one small part of life instead of the foundation for everything. We talked about this a few episodes ago. We talked about that two-story worldview, right?
Yep.
Where the church and my faith, all of that's on the top story, and then my life, my job, my family, that's on the bottom story.
Right. And that's why we keep coming back to Deuteronomy 6:7, right? You're doing that, having these conversations all the time when you sit down, when you rise up, as you walk along the way, right? It's, in other words, faith should be woven into our everyday life. And so having that conversation where your kids are comfortable talking to you, but also you're comfortable talking to your kids about these things in everyday moments. Access, what I mentioned earlier, that organization, they call it the one conversation model. And they say, it's the most successful parenting opportunities are because you have cultivated one conversation that you just have continued throughout your child's entire, childhood, so that it's the constantly coming back up to this one conversation, addressing their life from a biblical worldview.
To borrow from John Piper, parents, teach your children that Christ is more valuable than anything this world has to offer. Our kids are going to pick up from us on what we value most. And so if we talk about school, if we talk about sports, if we talk about entertainment, then that's what they're going to think is most important. But if we're constantly pointing them to Christ, then they're going to understand that that's what shapes their heart.
Yeah. I think that's so right. When we have that conversation and we bring it up all the time, values, right? That's a big key component to a worldview, is the things we value. And so I think that kind of brings us to our last point, and that's the point that we need to pray and model a bold faith ourselves.
Yeah. I would say that the most important thing that you can do as a parent is to pray for your kids and to model bold faith for them. We can teach them the Bible, we can give them great resources, and we can have all the right conversations, but at the end of the day, only God can transform their hearts.
Yeah, that's so true. And our kids are watching us, right? So they need to see that our faith is real. And if we're honest, right, we struggle with these issues too. We struggle with thinking through it and not knowing the answer. And that's okay, right? We need to be okay, like showing our kids, this is okay. Like, I don't have the answer, but I'm going to model for you even how to think through these things, how to think through the issues, how to go back and ask, those questions we asked earlier of, is it true? Is this good? Is it glorifying to God? And you can even stop, like turn down the radio, press pause on, whatever you're listening to and be like, hold on guys, let's stop for a second.
Yeah.
Is it true? Is it good? Is it glorifying to God? And have that conversation. And maybe you don't have the answer, but at least your kids are watching you think through it, so that they can think through it themselves.
And parents, let me encourage you with this. I know that some of the parents that listen to our podcast may come from split homes. So, mom and dad aren't together. Or maybe you even come from an unequally yoked home. So where you have maybe mom's a Christian and dad's not, or dad's a Christian and mom's not. Don't give up. If you're a Christian and you're in a relationship either with a split home and you can't control where they are all the time, because maybe they go to their other parents' house on the weekends, or they're shared custody, or maybe it's a situation where your husband isn't a Christian and mom, you are, you do your part. Like, you be the one who leads in this area. You pray, you model for them, right? Train up a child in the way he should go, but be sure that you go that way yourself.
Yep.
And that's the greatest lesson that we can give our kids, is our own faithfulness to Christ. So you can't control what the other parent is doing, but you can control what you are doing.
Right. So as we kind of come here to the end, like, here's the challenge for us parents, right? Just pick one of these steps. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to do it all at once. It's a process. And so it's just, you need to constantly be making progress in your own life. And so pick one of these steps that we've talked about. Maybe you start by praying for your kids every day. Just set a reminder on your phone to pray. Or maybe you just open up a conversation with your kids and say, about one of these situations. You do turn down the dial on the radio and ask those questions. Is it good? Is it true? Is it glorifying to God? But pick a way that you can start these conversations with your kids this week. So Lewis, as we wrap up, any final thoughts or encouragements for our listeners?
We know that the cultural challenges are not going away. The culture is not changing for us. But we don't have to be afraid. And remember, you're not doing this alone. God has called you to disciple your children, and He will give you the wisdom and the strength to do it. So trust Him, stay faithful, and watch how he works in your kids' lives, right? Like we've used the garden analogy before.
Yeah.
But you have to plant it, you have to water it, you have to fertilize it. And when you do that, it's going to grow. It's going to sprout. It's going to produce something. And so trust him, stay faithful, and watch how he is going to work in the life of your child.
Awesome. That's great. And if you guys enjoyed this episode, please share it with other parents who might find it helpful. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. If you've got questions or comments or ideas of episodes we could have, please reach out to us at podcast@waynechristian.org. We've already heard from several of our listeners. Yeah. We love that. Please do that. And please rate our episodes or our podcast on whatever platform you are using. We're still a really new podcast, so that helps us get out there and for other parents to find this content as well.
We'll only rate it if you give us 5 stars. If it's not 5 stars, don't rate it.
Yep, that's right. Just 5 stars. That's all we want here. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, keep leading the next generation to stand firm in their faith and influence their world for Christ.